In the spring of 1994, Nevada Highway 767 was as desolate as ever, a long stretch of blacktop cutting through the barren desert, with nothing but the endless horizon ahead. The road was quiet, save for the occasional howl of the wind sweeping over the dusty plains. It was the kind of place where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul, which suited Eddie Turner just fine. Eddie had been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, a solitary profession that gave him time to think, or not think, depending on the night. He'd grown accustomed to the loneliness of the road. The long stretches where the only sounds were the hum of his engine and the rhythmic thumping of tires against asphalt. He liked it that way. It was easier than dealing with people. But that night in late April was different. There was something off about the air, something unsettling that Eddie couldn't quite put his finger on. He chalked it up to fatigue. He'd been driving since dawn, and the road had a way of playing tricks on your mind after a while. As he glanced at the dashboard clock, the green digits blinked 12:13 a.m. Just a few more hours, he told himself. A few more hours, and he'd pull into a truck stop near the Nevada-California border, grab a hot meal, and catch some sleep. Up ahead, a figure appeared in the distance, small and wavering in the haze of his headlights. Eddie squinted, leaning forward in his seat. A hitchhiker, standing on the side of the road, arm raised, thumb out. Eddie hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he did. Too many crazies out there, too many risks. But something about this one was different. The figure was slight, almost frail, with long, flowing hair that shone silver in the moonlight. As Eddie's truck drew nearer, he realized it was a woman, her pale face turned toward him, eyes glinting in the darkness. Before he could think it through, Eddie found himself easing off the gas, the truck slowing as it rolled to a stop beside her. The woman stepped forward, her movements fluid and slow, like she was gliding across the pavement. "Need a ride?" Eddie called out, rolling down the passenger window. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood there, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Eddie's skin crawl. After a moment, she nodded and walked around to the passenger side door, pulling it open with a quiet creak. She climbed into the cab, her movements still unnervingly smooth, and settled into the seat beside him. Eddie glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was wearing a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the warm desert night, and her hair fell in soft waves down her back. Her skin was pale, too pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. And those eyes, dark, bottomless, with a flicker of something cold behind them. "You headed somewhere?" Eddie asked, trying to keep his voice casual as he put the truck back in gear. She turned to look at him, her lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Just north," she said softly, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "Keep driving. I'll tell you where." Eddie nodded, though a chill had settled deep in his gut. Something about this felt wrong, but he couldn't back out now. The woman didn't seem dangerous, just strange. And besides, he'd driven through stranger things in the desert before. The truck rumbled forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, oppressive, broken only by the occasional rattle of the truck or the hiss of the wind outside. Eddie kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was watching him, her gaze fixed on him like a predator sizing up its prey. After what felt like an eternity, Eddie cleared his throat. "You from around here?" he asked, trying to break the silence. The woman didn't respond right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as though she were remembering something long forgotten. "I used to be," she said. "A long time ago." Eddie frowned. "Where you headed now?" She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she looked out the window. "I'm not sure," she murmured. "But I've been waiting for this ride. A long time." Eddie's unease deepened. There was something off about her, something he couldn't place. He glanced at her again, noticing how she barely seemed to blink, how her chest hardly rose and fell with breath. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "I don't usually pick up hitchhikers," Eddie said, more to fill the silence than anything else. She smiled again, that same unsettling curve of her lips. I know, she whispered. But you picked me. Eddie's heart skipped a beat, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He didn't like this. He didn't like this at all. Suddenly, the woman pointed ahead, her hand hovering in the air like a shadow. Turn here. Eddie blinked. They were in the middle of nowhere, no crossroads, no signs, just the endless stretch of desert and the pale glow of the moon. But something in her voice compelled him, and before he knew it, he was turning the wheel, guiding the truck off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The truck bumped along the uneven ground, dust kicking up in the headlights. The farther they went, the darker it seemed to get, the desert swallowing them whole. Eddie's stomach twisted with a growing sense of dread. Where exactly are we going? He asked, his voice tight. The woman didn't answer. She just stared ahead, her eyes fixed on something Eddie couldn't see. As they drove deeper into the desert, the air around them grew thick, almost suffocating. The sky seemed to close in, the stars winking out one by one. Eddie's hands were slick with sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't right. This wasn't real. I think we should turn around, Eddie said, his voice shaking. This doesn't seem. Before he could finish, the truck shuddered to a stop. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in absolute silence. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. He turned the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. The truck was dead. Panic surged through him as he turned to the woman, ready to demand answers, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the door slightly ajar. Eddie's blood ran cold. He hadn't heard her leave. He hadn't even felt the truck move. Heart racing, he threw open his door and stumbled out into the desert night. The wind had picked up, swirling dust around him, but there was no sign of the woman. No footprints in the dirt. No trace of her at all. Eddie's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the horizon. Hey, he shouted, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. Where are you? There was no response, only the eerie whistle of the wind through the scrub brush. And then, in the distance, Eddie saw something, a figure, standing still, watching him from the shadows. It was her. The woman. She stood impossibly still, her pale face glowing in the moonlight. Eddie took a step toward her, then froze as something strange happened. Her shape seemed to change, to twist and stretch, her limbs elongating, her body contorting into something inhuman. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, no longer cold, but filled with a terrible hunger. Eddie backed away, his legs trembling. What are you?" he whispered. The thing that had been the woman took a step forward, its movements unnatural, jerky. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, far too many for a human. Eddie's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The creature smiled, a sickening, hungry smile. "You picked me," it hissed, its voice a twisted echo of the woman's. "And now you're mine." With a scream, Eddie turned and ran, his boots kicking up dust as he fled into the desert, leaving his truck, and whatever that thing was, far behind. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the sound of its laughter, echoing in the darkness. And no one would ever find him again.